This will be a very general guide on how to grow mushrooms. Different mushrooms are going to have different needs. Obviously, I'm not going to go through every mushroom need. This will just be a basic general overview guide to get you started. It will not show you how to grow specific mushroom species. Firstly, you'll have to identify the type of mushroom, whether that's a land mushroom, which will fruit straight up, a log mushroom, which will fruit to the side, or a mycorrhizal mushroom, which will fruit next to another plant. I'm going to come back to this later. Mushroom growing follows a general 3-step process: spores, substrate, and fruiting. Spores are the seeds of a mushroom. You take the mushroom species spores of your choosing and you apply it to a substrate it likes. The substrate will help the spores germinate. The spores will turn into mycelium, where the fungus will colonize the substrate. You then match the species' fruiting requirements, and then the fungus will fruit mushrooms from the substrate. The mushroom will then release its spores when it is finished. This is a very oversimplified version. Now let's get a little bit more in depth. Spores. Depending on the species, the spores have to be stored at a certain temperature. Different species of mushroom spores like different temperature ranges, and they will germinate at different temperatures. The more in tune they are with their temperature and environment, the faster they will grow. Substrate. Depending on the species, each different mushroom species likes different types of substrates. The more in tune they are with the substrate they like, the faster they will colonize the substrate. Fruiting. Depending on the species, each different mushroom species will fruit at a different temperature, humidity, and environment. The more in tune they are with their fruiting requirements, the more they will fruit and the happier they will be. So again, depending on the mushroom species, you will have different requirements for spores, substrate, and fruiting. Before we go even more in depth, I have to briefly mention contamination. By far, your biggest challenge will be contamination. Most people are pretty good with materials and resources. Where they screw up, and where I have screwed up, is contamination. There are ways to mitigate contamination. Firstly, avoid touching and transferring as much as possible. Secondly, use as much sanitation as possible to kill any contamination. That means wearing gloves and using isopropyl alcohol or hydrogen peroxide. Now let's go even more in depth. Spores. All mushrooms release spores, just in different ways. Spore prints. Spore prints allow you to have a copy of the mushroom spores. Liquid cultures. Liquid cultures are very, very useful. Basically, it's a bunch of mushroom spores contained within a liquid. You can then transfer those spores into a liquid inoculate. Liquid inoculates are spore syringes. They are used to inoculate the substrate, or in other words, apply the spores onto the substrate. Agar plates. Agar plates are used to see what the spores look like when they germinate. They show you the mycelium. They are particularly useful if you want to know if your liquid culture is contaminated. Basically, you take your liquid inoculate and you get some spores from the liquid culture and you put it on an agar plate. If it is contaminated, you can toss the liquid culture out. Cloning. You can clone certain mushroom strains. For instance, if a certain mushroom has fruited a lot, you can take those spores and apply them on an agar plate through an agar wedge and keep making clones of it. If you are interested, there are many online tutorials you can check out. Substrates. Substrates are used for both colonization and for fruiting. Some substrates are just used for colonization, some substrates are just used for fruiting, and some substrates are used for both. You can transfer the mycelium from one substrate onto another substrate. However, the more you transfer, the more you risk for contamination. Grains. Grains are used for substrate colonization. There are rye grains, bird seeds, wheat, brown rice, and white rice. There are also many online substrates used and invented by mushroom growers that you can find online, depending on the species. The most common being brown rice flour cakes. These are nutrient-rich mixtures to make sure the mycelium will colonize the substrate quickly within a jar. There's also bulk substrates. These are again nutrient-rich mixtures, this time in a bin. These are more concerned with land mushrooms than side fruiting mushrooms. You can also find grow-in-one bags on Etsy, which are very, very useful. There are alternative techniques to all of this. You can find them out online, depending on the species, depending on your resources, and depending on how much you want to fruit. There's also the dilemma of using a bag or using a jar. Both can be used for colonization and for fruiting, although typically the bag is more used for fruiting. The jar is just used for colonization. The jar is also a pain in the ass to clean, especially if you get contamination. Every time you transfer or touch something, you are increasing the risk for contamination. Again, depending on how you set up your substrate will depend on what type of mushroom you are working with. If you're working with a land mushroom, you may use wood chips or manure, right? Because these mushrooms are fruiting straight up. If you are working with a log mushroom, you may use a bag or logs, right? Because these mushrooms are fruiting to the side. If you are interested, there are many online tutorials you can check out. Fruiting. Fruiting chambers allow for the fungus to fruit a mushroom. You have to be careful where you set them up. Depending on how you set up the fruiting will depend on the type of mushroom you are growing. Tents. You can use tents if you are going to grow a lot of mushrooms and you have the luxury of a big space. Typically, you would use a Martha tent. You can buy them online or you can build your own with lights and everything. You'll also need a big humidifier. There are many online you can purchase. Shotgun fruiting chamber. So it's a plastic bin with a lot of small holes, like if it was shot by a shotgun. These holes are used for fresh air exchange. You would then use perlite, which will allow for the water to rise, increasing the humidity. Mono tubs, a little bit more complicated. Basically, you are going to create a basic fresh air exchange system. It's going to have bigger holes, fewer than a shotgun fruiting chamber. The holes are covered with tape, which will allow for more CO2 to build up within the bin. Fungi release CO2. You do not need to use perlite in monotubs. That's more for shotgun fruiting chambers. Covering the holes already allows for that moisture to build up. You're going to apply spores into it. The bulk substrate, which if we remember is from over here, which is already in the monotub, which means the mycelium will colonize the substrate within the fruiting chamber, which is really nice. This is typically used for land mushrooms. You have to play around with this a bit to get it right with the temperature, humidity, and oxygen, which, as we talked about, varies from species to species. Alternatively, you could just create an automated monotub, which is much easier. They are available on Etsy. You can also fruit outside, so that would be, again, your logs and wood chips, and you can allow nature to do its work. You can also fruit inside without a specific fruiting chamber where it'll just grow itself. You do have to work a little bit with a water spray, however, you do risk it drying out due to no humidity. If you are interested, there are many online tutorials you can check out. Let's go back to the type of mushrooms. Depending on what type of mushroom you are going to grow, it is going to be different for spores, substrates, and fruiting. Land mushrooms. Land mushrooms grow straight up. Their substrate is very, very easy to replicate, which separates them from mycorrhizal mushrooms. Some examples of land mushrooms can be portobellos, psilocybin species, wood bluet mushroom, the wine cap mushroom, and the cordyceps species. Wood chips are a good example. They serve a lot of mushrooms, particularly wine caps, wood bluets, and some psilocybin species. Manure is another good example. It serves a lot of mushrooms like portobellos and some psilocybin species. Cordyceps, think of cordyceps, that has to be insects. That serves a lot of, that serves all cordyceps species, really. I will add more to this group as I test more and more mushroom species in the future. Next up is log mushrooms. Log mushrooms fruit to the side. It doesn't make sense for them to fruit straight up, although they can. Typically, though, they fruit to the side. Some examples can be the oyster species, the Japanese species, lion's mane, jelly, the brick cap, hen of the woods, chestnut mushroom, pulpinia, chicken of the woods, turkey tails, and reishi, and a whole bunch of others. I will add more mushroom species to this group as I test more and more mushrooms. You can use bags or logs for log mushrooms. Bags will allow you to fruit it to the side. You just open up the bag and you allow the fungus to do its work. Some species will work both on logs and bags. Some species just work with logs. With logs, different species colonize different types of tree logs. You have to know what type of tree log works for each individual mushroom species, and when it was cut down. There are guides to this, link in the description. Mycorrhizal mushrooms are by far the hardest to cultivate. They grow near the presence of a certain tree or a plant. Some species of mycorrhizal mushrooms can include the truffles, boletes, morels, amanitas, puffballs, and chanterelles. Amanita perskinia is an example I can think of where it grew near one of my conifer trees. Companies are trying to figure out how to grow these mushrooms as we speak. They're using the roots of certain plants, and basically when the temperature is right and the humidity is right and the mycelium senses that the plant is there, the fungus will fruit the mushroom. It's an ongoing project. If I ever figure out how to cultivate any of these mushrooms, I will definitely do a video on it. So in review, when you choose a mushroom species to cultivate, you have to know whether it's a land, log, or mycorrhizal mushroom, and its temperature, humidity, environment, and substrate requirements for fruiting and colonization. These places are filled with people who will hopefully stir you in that direction. There are a lot of links in the description. Make sure to check them out. I will do more videos on each different mushroom species in the future. This is a growing project of mine.